much. I'm Terry Roselle. I serve in the Rosemary Flanigan Chair at the Center for Practical Bioethics. And I will be introducing our speaker in just a bit. But first I want to introduce Sister Rosemary Flanigan. She needs no introduction for the majority of people here, but there are always some who don't know her. So what you ought to know is that Sister Flanigan is a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph Coranda religious order. She is a person of faith. Dr. Flanigan is a PhD philosopher. Professor Flanigan retired nearly 25 years ago now from Rockhurst University, and then again retired about 5 years ago from the Center for Practical Bioethics. And Rosemary, these are all the same person. And Rosemary, as she's known to most of us, is indeed celebrating an 89th birthday this month. But the big one, 90, is next year. So I'm wondering if we could be a big choir and rehearse the happy birthday song that we'll be singing next year when you all come back to celebrate the big one. So let's sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rosemary. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, my. You are all so dear. Thank you always for coming. Without you, there would be no this. But when I was thinking, we're missing people. I miss Hans. I miss Dr. Marge Searage. I miss Joanne Berkeley. I miss Viva Flanigan and Gary. But then from upstate New York comes Gary's widow, who brings her mother, who's been here before, and then brings her brother, who's never seen Kansas City. So what a treat for him. And then, of course, my friend Pat Brown, who always drives up for 21 years now, drives up from St. Louis for this affair and takes us to breakfast tomorrow. This has been a wonderful 21-year history. We've gotten marvelous people here to speak. And Terry, let's introduce the new one tonight, who is going to cap the climax.
If you want the standard bio of Dr. David Castra, the one that's on the dust cover of his book, you just buy the book and you'll get the bio too, or you can Google him. But what you probably will not find out about Dr. Casarett by Googling is this. And he's a little nervous right now. David Casarett was born about 47 years ago in Hawaii. He was an early contemporary of our president. I don't know if you were born in the same hospital at the same time, but roughly with Barack Obama. He was raised in Hawaii and other places, including Sweden, and says that he was a faculty brat. His parents are academics and moved around a good bit, and he went with them. David commutes to work 25 miles round trip on a bicycle. David's advanced directives at his healthy 47 years includes a do resuscitate order, or directive, of course. And he stated his advanced directives in this regard to the entire KCUR audience this morning, just in case anything would happen. Presumably, David would prefer that his rescuers someday not use some of the methods that he described in his book, Shocked. Resuscitation methods like, you know what's coming, like blowing tobacco smoke up the rectum. And so if we have an emergency situation here tonight, we'll not use the blowing smoke method of resuscitation. And lastly, what you will not learn about David by Googling him, but will if you read his last two books, what you'll learn is that he has a quirky sense of humor. Quirky sense of humor. So what is so funny about resuscitation attempts, David? And if you want to know, read the book. But first, welcome our 21st Annual Flanigan Lecturer, Dr. David Castra.
It's one of the best introductions I've had in a while. Good evening. It's great to be here. It'd be greater if the microphone worked, but it's pretty great, even without the microphone.
Let me check. You're on.
I've been told that I'm on and the microphone is working. Your head shakes. Yes? But can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, we're in business. All we need now are slides. And then life will be good. Terry will solve the slide problem while I express how wonderful it is to be here, how honored I am by the invitation, how intimidated I am to be following a premature 90th birthday song, which is really hard for anybody to top. So I'm not even going to try to do that. What I will talk about, though, is death. So I thought, if folks are okay with this, we'll spend the next 35, 40 minutes talking about death. Does that sound good? We can switch to medical marijuana if you want, but I thought, yeah, death, good. So, as either remedial lesson in death for those of you who need it, or sort of a quick intro for those who may be new to this topic, I thought I would show you briefly how death works. And this is kind of an oversimplification because it's kind of a complicated process, but I'll give you the kindergarten version. So that's what life looks like, more or less. Those of you who are physicians in the audience, nurses, other healthcare providers will notice that this is a pretty normal EKG. You have a little P wave where the atria in your heart do their thing, a little bit of a pause as the impulse travels from the atria to the ventricle, big spike there as the ventricles contract, period of time where the heart kind of recalibrates, and then if you're very, very lucky, we'll do all that again. And in the space that it's taken me to explain that to you, your hearts hopefully have been through 15 or 20 cycles. If they haven't, you should take a moment, look to your left, look to your right. Everybody still with us? Good. If you weren't still with us, this is one thing that you might see. Anybody want to call that rhythm? Physicians not allowed to shout out. So I heard somebody say it, ventricular fibrillation. If you see that actually in real life, like in an operating room as I did as I was researching Shocked, spent some time in an operating room, it's really sort of a scary sight. Your heart normally contracts in a regular, reliable, organized way. When it's in fibrillation, it basically just sits in the chest cavity and quivers. It looks like a little shaking bowl of Jell-O, which is really pretty frightening because we rely on this organ every single second. And when it doesn't work, it really, really doesn't work. So the next thing you see is something you can't see, unfortunately. But if you look very carefully, you'll see a straight line. And that straight line is called a bad thing. That's the technical medical term. They're layman's terms, but I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. I'm assuming you're a technically sophisticated audience, also called asystole. And that's another word for death. Again, oversimplifying a little bit. But in the time that it takes to go from a normal sinus rhythm through ventricular fibrillation, when your heart's in VFib, it's not pumping blood, but it's also not getting blood. So it can't exist very long in VFib before it turns into asystole. So the period of time that you have before this turns into this is usually measured in a matter of minutes. Put another way, that whether you're a paramedic or a cardiologist or a first responder, you really only have a few minutes to be able to reverse this cycle and turn this back into this. Because once you get to a flat line, it's really, really hard to do anything. The lesson there, which you learn pretty quickly on your average television program, is that whether you're George Clooney or your local cardiologist, you don't have a lot of time to reverse that process. You really just have a couple of minutes, usually the space of time encompassed in a commercial break. Somebody has a cardiac arrest, you break for a commercial, 2.5 minutes later, by the time you get back, that person is either awake, running out the door, probably, if it's a sitcom, or they're really and truly dead. And that's what I always thought was the case. That's sort of what we're taught, that people either bounce back or not fairly quickly. Things changed, though, when this girl died. I use died in quotes because she didn't really, but she certainly looked as though she did. This is a picture of a girl named Michelle Funk, who was about 2.5 years old when she fell into a creek outside of Salt Lake City in Utah and drowned. She was underwater for about an hour before first responders pulled her out. She had washed downstream. People couldn't find her. Finally found her trapped under a riverbank underwater, had been under about an hour, as near as anybody could tell. At that point, I think most rescuers would have given up. Somebody who had been, for all intents and purposes, underwater for an hour, not breathing, no heartbeat, no signs of life, that probably would have prompted most rescuers to give up. But for whatever reason, they didn't. They tried to resuscitate her. They tried for another 2 hours to resuscitate her as they transferred her to a local emergency room, then into the intensive care unit, and then eventually into the OR. So for 3 hours, she had no heartbeat, not breathing, no signs of life. But then at the end of 3 hours, her heart finally started to beat again. And then about a day later, she started to breathe on her own. 3 weeks later, she left the hospital. About 16 years after that, she got married. She's still registered at Macy's, in case you're curious. Still waiting for an ice cream maker, so if you want to offer her your congratulations, you could shell out $250. I'm sure she'd appreciate it. But that really changed the nature and the science of what CPR and resuscitation could be. Remember that conventional wisdom of you've got 5-10 minutes to turn around a case of cardiac arrest, after which your chances of success go way down? That's still true for a lot of people. It's still true for most people, honestly. But this exception to the rule, 3 hours, makes you wonder, right? If somebody could actually come back after 3 hours, might 4 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, 12, a day, 2 days, what might be possible? It was that question, actually, that made me start wanting to write the book Shocked. So I wanted to see from the other side of the fence. I'm a hospice and palliative care physician. I take care of patients near the end of life, but I wanted to get a sense of what was possible and what might be possible someday. So that's one story. Let me tell you another story, which will bookend the rest of our conversation together. This is a photograph of a woman named Lorraine Bayless, who was in her 80s when she collapsed in the public room of a retirement community in Bakersfield, California. And what happened then is interesting, fascinating, a little bit scary, and I think tells us a lot about how far the science of resuscitation has come, but also what it means. So let me give you an excerpt of the transcript from this 911 call. So she collapses, and then a nurse who's standing nearby, named Colleen, calls 911 to ask for help. And this is more or less how the conversation goes. So the dispatcher, whose name was Tracy, says when she begins to understand that Miss Bayless doesn't have a heartbeat, doesn't have a pulse, is not breathing, suggests starting CPR. And then the nurse, Colleen, says, well, we can't do CPR. And if you listen to this, there's a bit of a pause on the tape as the dispatcher processes this information, as she realizes that this person calling 911 has suddenly taken life-sustaining treatment off the agenda. It seems a little bit odd. But she bounces back valiantly and asks whether there are any guests there that might be willing to do CPR. But apparently there are no guests. And then the dispatcher asks if there's a gardener. This is the point in the conversation that you begin to realize the dispatcher has now officially reached the bottom of the barrel resuscitation-wise, because once you drag a guy away from his weed whacker to do CPR, you really don't have many options. So long story short, they actually don't do CPR. 911 is called. The ambulance shows up, scoops her up, takes her to a local hospital where she's pronounced dead about 30 minutes later. This made national and international headlines. Some of those headlines I've shown you, which basically summarize the perceived narrative of an uncaring, unfeeling nurse, a bad nursing home that refuses to keep this woman alive. That was the public story. About a day or two after that, the Lorraine Bayless's family weighed in and said, I won't read this to you, but basically said, this is exactly what, or mostly what, our mother would have wanted. She wouldn't have wanted that ambulance trip. She wouldn't have wanted to be pronounced dead in an emergency department, but dying in the dining room right outside her home is exactly the way she wanted to go. The other thing, by the way, about this case was an autopsy was done, and it turned out that Lorraine Bayless had died of such a massive stroke that CPR really would not have been effective. So this wasn't a simple arrhythmia that could have been reversed, but it's something that CPR would not have been effective for. But again, think about that media outcry, this sense that there's an obligation that everybody needs to have CPR before they die, whether they want it or not. So those are the two faces of CPR and resuscitation that I want you, me, us all to think about. There are the amazing cases like Michelle Funk, who defy all odds, do exceptionally well, go on to get married and use ice cream makers, which is my personal definition of successful quality of life. But then also patients like Lorraine Bayless, who get treatment like CPR and attempts at resuscitation, people who don't want it, patients who wouldn't benefit from it, and people like the nurse and the nursing home that get lambasted publicly for not doing what a patient would not have wanted. And the proper approach to CPR and resuscitation, I would submit to all of you, is somewhere in between the two. Each of those is pretty easy, right? I mean, assuming that we should do CPR and resuscitate everyone, that's pretty easy. But figuring out whether, when, how, and how long to use it, that's the hard part. I won't answer those questions in the next 20 or 25 minutes, but those are questions we all need to think about. First, a little bit of history. Any guesses where this is? Amsterdam, right. This is not only a great city, wonderful beer, great art museums, but it's also, whether you knew it or not, the place where CPR and resuscitation began. So this is going back to the early 1800s, late 1700s actually, where a bunch of Amsterdam citizens were concerned by the frequency with which their fellow Amsterdam citizens seemed to be falling into canals and drowning. And this isn't just physicians and surgeons. It was apothecaries and merchants and bankers and school teachers, everybody. They banded together and formed a society, the Amsterdam Society in Favor of Drowned Persons, which doesn't make for a good acronym. Maybe it's better in Dutch. I don't know. But they banded together and began to test ways to bring back the dead. And they kept religious records, which are available online if you're curious, with a variety of reports of what happens when you pull people out of a canal, do various things to them to try to bring them back. So what did they do? Well, they did pretty much everything that you can think of. They tickled the back of people's throats with feathers, which, by the way, is not something you really want to do to a potentially dead person, because worst case scenario, it does nothing. Best case scenario is you've taken somebody who's just swallowed a lot of nasty canal water, you tickle the back of their throats, what do? They throw up, and then they inhale that canal water, and you've just given them aspiration pneumonia. Congratulations. So tickling with feathers, no, bad idea. Breathing with bellows was popular, rolling people over a barrel. My own personal favorite, throwing drowning victims over the back of a trotting horse, in theory because it replicates some of what happens during the normal physiology of breathing. I admit, I probably should not admit this, but anybody who's read the book will know this. In order to figure out what that felt like, I actually tried this and wrote about it in the book. And it is absolutely as unpleasant as you think it would be. Still, when I run into my mother at family reunions, the first thing she says is, before we talk about anything else, I still can't believe you let somebody strap you to the back of a horse and you didn't tell your mother. So I still get flack over that. So they tried pretty much everything. The science of resuscitation over the next 10 or 20 years moved to England, London in particular, for the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned, which later became the Royal Humane Society. They also kept records of successful resuscitations. They also gave medals and prizes for accounts of resuscitation, sort of a great example of crowdsourcing research. If you pulled somebody out of a canal, tried to resuscitate them, and then wrote up what you did and what happened, they would pay you for that. There are also people, by the way, who would pay people to bring them bodies to experiment on, meaning to try to bring them back from the dead. You can kind of think of that as a sort of like deposits on bottles for people. You bring the people in and hope that somebody could do something with them. That died out pretty quickly, fortunately. Lots of investigation, lots of innovation. This is a picture of the so-called receiving house in Hyde Park, which was really a laboratory for experimentation. We'd bring people in and then try to resuscitate them. Progress in reviving people. This is an account from the mid-19th century that describes very briefly the transition from using tubes inserted through the back of the throat, instead using tubes inserted through the nose. And the logic behind that, as some of you are nodding, is that if you don't have much experience in intubating people to breathe for them, as arguably many people did not have much experience 200 years ago, a nasal intubation is more foolproof approach than the so-called orotracheal route. And 200 years ago, they discovered nasotracheal intubation is the way to go. We still use that in situations where it's a difficult intubation for somebody, say, who's overweight or in the setting of trauma. So still using some of these tricks. Also, some successes in resuscitating chickens, in case you care. This is the first account I can find of a successful defibrillation and resuscitation by a guy named Peter Hildegard back in the 1700s, who was a Danish physician who either couldn't find volunteers to resuscitate or just really didn't like chickens. But describes in gory detail how he would shock these chickens and stop its heart, and then reshock the chicken to restart its heart. And he reports at the end that it didn't eat for a day and a night. Then later it was very well and even laid an egg, which is, you can talk about positive, successful outcomes in resuscitation, but that's probably about as successful as it's going to get. The Russian method was a process by which drowning victims, accident victims, were buried in snow and ice, often up to their necks, which seems sort of cruel and unusual, died out of fashion. But there's some interesting science here, and this is one example which I'm sharing with you because some of the things that happened back 200 years ago, like tickling the back of people's throats with feathers, we should just leave alone. But some of these, like the Russian method, actually have some science. And we really began to discover that when we looked, meaning we as a scientific community began to figure out what successful resuscitation looked like. So I gave you the story of Michelle Funk, did amazingly well. I told that she fell into a creek and drowned. What I didn't tell you is that she fell into a creek and drowned in the spring, where the water was full of snow melt. It was very, very cold. This is another success story. Anna Bagenholm was a medical student when she fell through the ice outside of Oslo in Norway, drowned, was underwater for about the same period of time. Her core temperature, her core body temperature is only around 55 degrees when they pulled her out. Normal body temperature Fahrenheit is 98.6. So she was very, very cold. And to this day, that's the coldest body temperature of any drowning victim who survived and lived to tell the tale. Not only did she live, she did well. She finished medical school, did a residency in radiology, and is now alive and well and happily married. But Bagenholm was in her 20s when that happened. So she had lost most of the brain plasticity that that Michelle Funk had going for her. So what was her secret? It wasn't being young, or at least as young as Michelle Funk, but the secret for Agenholm's survival, everybody realized, was that she was really, really, really cold. That got a lot of people thinking about how the benefits of cold. Remember the Russian method? That sounded crazy, but maybe there are some benefits to extreme cold in saving lives. That's leading now to a lot of technology that's out there. These are, on your left, some devices that are designed to cool people quickly by using chilled saline or other fluids that wrap around people. This is a great little device that I saw being studied in a laboratory, available in the UK. I don't think it's made it to, in the EU, I don't think it's made it to the United States yet. It's called the Rhinochill, R-H-I-N-O as in nose. Rhinochill, and the way it works is it takes perfluorocarbon, which is a hydrocarbon that has a really low evaporation point, circulates it around the back of the nasal passages, it evaporates, and it cools the back of the nasal passages, which by itself doesn't sound all that interesting. But think for a moment about anatomy, right? You have the nasal passages. Right above the nasal passages, you have something called the cribriform plate, which is a really thin layer of bone that's highly vascular, lots of blood vessels. And above that, you have the brain. And the blood vessels there go back and forth into and out of the brain. So if you cool the back of the sinuses, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but you cool the back of the sinuses, it's a really very, very efficient way to cool the brain. So why is that good? If you cool any organ, particularly the brain, you reduce its need for oxygen, essentially slowing down its metabolism. So by slowing down its metabolism, somebody whose brain really would have gotten into some serious trouble after 10 or 15 minutes at its normal metabolic rate, what if you could slow its metabolism down? What if you could slow its metabolic rate and reduce its need for oxygen by 50%, 70%, 95%? You could actually stretch that grace period from 15 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour, potentially more. So one theory was that the reason that Michelle Funk, Anna Agenholm, and other victims who did really well is because they were so cold, they were so hypothermic that their brains and other organs, mostly their brains' need for oxygen was reduced by so much that they could actually tolerate, survive, and do well with an hour, 2, or 3 with essentially no oxygen. So that's one glimpse of the future. What is next? I'll give you one thing that sounds like science fiction and maybe is and probably is, but maybe isn't. So if you ask somebody whether suspended animation is real, whether it's science fiction, I think most people would tell you that's science fiction. That's just crazy. There's no such thing as suspended animation. In movies ranging from Doctor Who to Serenity to Aliens, suspended animation is all over the place, right? Anybody traveling from Earth to any planet winds up in a state of suspended animation. Suspended animation, right, is the process by which, at least in science fiction, by which you reduce somebody's metabolism to a very, very tiny fraction of what it is normally. So in theory, I guess, people don't age as they're traveling from here to some outer planet, at least in theory. Science fiction, right? Well, sort of. If you think about it, there's a lot of suspended animation going on every day, particularly in the winter, right? So think about animals, think about animal hibernation, think about all of these animals entering into a state of hibernation for a period of several months over the winter when their metabolism goes down to 1 or 2% of normal. Hibernation, suspended animation, same thing. So once you realize that, as many researchers began to in the 50s, suspended animation didn't seem so crazy. Right? There are lots of animals out there that manage to hibernate. This is Aristotle's view of hibernation of birds. It turns out that birds actually don't hibernate. They're the one group that doesn't do well in the hibernation category. The common poorwill, as far as we know, is the only bird that hibernates. But there are lots of other animals that do. And so there are a lot of researchers now who are trying to figure out how animals hibernate so that we can figure out how to induce hibernation in people. So if you want to know what the future of CPR and resuscitation is, that would be my vote for one of the biggest guesses for the future. This is still speculative. But there's one group who, in the book, I refer to as Team Lemur, because that's some of the terminology that some of the researchers I spoke with used. This is a guy named Peter Klopfer, who was one of the founders of the Duke Lemur Sanctuary outside of Raleigh-Durham, at Chapel Hill, actually, in North Carolina. And this is a picture of a fat-tailed dwarf lemur. And I've met them in person, and I can tell you they are exactly as cute as they look. They're really quite sweet. Especially when they're hibernating, because they just kind of sit there in a ball and they stretch occasionally and they roll over, but they really don't do much. They're sort of like slightly mobile plush toys that you would give a dog. But Klopfer and a lot of other people are really interested in lemurs because lemurs are the only primates, at least the only primates that we know of, that hibernate. So the theory is if we can figure out how lemurs hibernate, lemurs are closer to us biologically than are other animals like bears or squirrels that also hibernate. So the theory is if we can figure out how lemurs hibernate, we could figure out how to hack the human system and induce hibernation too. There's another approach, thinking about the future of resuscitation and what this could mean for us. And it has nothing to do with temperature. We've talked a lot about cold and the Russian method and what temperature means. Quick question for the audience. Do bears hibernate? Yes? No? Sure. You grew up in my generation, you watched Yogi Bear cartoons. I was actually really disappointed to know there really was no Jellystone Park. I didn't discover that until I was like 25 years old, but it's a slow learner. So everybody knows that bears hibernate. There's a guy named Henry Clapp, though, who's a bear hunter, who back in the early 20th century snuck into bears' dens when they were hibernating, and he noticed that when they were sleeping, there was steam issuing from these bears' nostrils. And he, based on that observation, concluded that they don't really hibernate, right? Because hibernation is associated with a drop in metabolism, a drop in body temperature. But he said their body temperature really couldn't have dropped that much because, you know, they're breathing steam. So he advanced this theory, and this is a fur trapper, a hunter, not a biologist. But he advanced this theory 100 years ago that bears really don't hibernate. They just, I don't know, sleep really well. And that theory actually held currency for about 100 years. Until some researchers in Alaska studied hibernating bears, and they noticed that Clapp was actually right, that bears' temperature only drops by a couple of degrees when they hibernate. But they also found that their metabolism drops by about 95%. And that's interesting, because everything I was telling you before about how cold causes a reduction in temperature, these bears are managing to drop their metabolism without any change in temperature. And that means that maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. It's not a matter of making people or squirrels or marmots or bears cold and the cold shuts down their metabolism. Maybe there are other ways to shut down that metabolism. A couple ways to do that. Ice, we've talked about. Some interest about 10 years ago in hydrogen sulfide as a way to shut down metabolism. Initial experiments worked well. Hydrogen sulfide is that nasty stuff that comes out of trash, garbage, rotten eggs. Interesting experiments with hydrogen sulfide, initially promising. Nobody could replicate them. There was a big company that was founded, got a lot of funding. The guy who discovered hydrogen sulfide and hibernation got a MacArthur Genius Award, and then all of that research just evaporated. The company folded. Nobody's quite sure what the story was, but hydrogen sulfide is definitely out. There is, though, another potential possibility on the horizon, and that's a molecule called adenosine monophosphate, which those of you who might remember this from college or medical school know is part of the energy cycle in cells. And this is a picture of a guy named Cheng-Chi Lee, who's a researcher at University of Texas in Houston. And he's done interesting animal experiments in which he's shown that injecting AMP into mice effectively drops their metabolism directly. There's a secondary drop in temperature, but it really has an amazing, profound, and really very fast effect on metabolism. It's amazing. If you go into his lab, you can actually watch these mice scampering around. He gives them an injection, and then within the space of about 15, 20 seconds, they seem to fall asleep, they curl up, they get limp, and then he measures their metabolism in a sealed container. And you can see their metabolism take a nosedive from a resting rate down to about 1%. And the best part is that this has a really short half-life. So within a minute or two, the mice bounce back, their metabolism goes up, their temperature rises again, and they start scampering around. So Lee is very clear that he's not anywhere near clinical trials, but it's really, really hard for even me as a palliative care physician not to look at experiments like this and think about what this would mean for somebody who has a cardiac arrest on a tennis court, who maybe has 5 or 10 minutes to get to an emergency department where we can restart a heart before she's going to start getting serious brain damage. What if you could, with a simple injection, maybe an injection that's available out on the tennis court, somebody gives her an injection, drops her metabolism to 1 or 2% of normal, the ambulance crew shows up, they load her in, they do a nice leisurely drive to the emergency department where there are diagnostic tests and she's resuscitated. If that seems crazy, think about a soldier injured on the battlefield, like an 8-hour flight from an operating theater, you could do the same thing. So a lot of interest in this and other forms of technology that would make resuscitation much, much more effective in situations where right now you have 5-10 minutes at the most, after which time you're out of luck. So while we're talking about the future, one last future question to get you thinking about. It's really difficult to talk about the future of CPR, resuscitation, life, death, without talking about cryonics. Those of you who know about cryonics, it's the science, although some people would say it's not a science at all, of freezing people after they die and then reviving them 500, 1,000 years in the future when the science, medicine, and technology exists to reverse whatever caused your death in the first place. Are you with me? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Yeah, so I spent a weird weekend with a room full of, and I'm not making this up, they call themselves cryonauts, as in astronauts, cryonauts. Yeah, which it doesn't do a whole lot for their public relations image. But these are all people who believe to varying degrees that this is possible, and they're signing up. The going rate, by the way, is $70,000 if you want your head preserved in liquid nitrogen, or $200,000 if you want your body preserved. And if you're wondering what anyone's going to do with just your head in 1,000 years, that's a detail that has not yet been worked out. But the good news is you've got a lot of time to figure it out. So there are a lot of people who are signing up for this and paying for it. That might be in the future of CPR and resuscitation, but let's just put that aside for now. Just mentioning it for the sake of completeness. The biggest advance in resuscitation, if you were to pin me down and ask me, I would say it's you. It's me. It's all of us. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have been through basic life support, CPR training? So the majority, at least half, maybe 2/3, right? And that's much more than it would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's safe to say that pretty much anybody who has a cardiac arrest these days, anybody who passes out, anybody who needs CPR, probably has, unless they're a hermit living on a mountainside in Nepal, probably has somebody around them who knows CPR. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts are getting CPR training in schools, in retirement facilities, you name it. Pretty much everybody can do CPR, and everybody does. And that probably more than all of the technology that I showed you before, or anything that's coming down the pike in the future, is improving survival rates. Lots of certificate programs available, lots of training available, and that training has actually gotten more effective and simpler. Some of you know that the current training is for so-called hands-only CPR, so no mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which was done partly because mouth-to-mouth is hard to do if you don't know what you're doing, which most rescuers don't, even for medical professionals. Also because there's the ick factor that turned a lot of people off. I mean, seriously, people wouldn't, literally, there are tragic stories of people not doing CPR, not saving a life because they were scared by the mouth-to-mouth piece. So the solution was, if it doesn't work and it's turning people off, just take it off the menu. So hands-only CPR is now the way to go. How far have we come? Here's some examples of survival rates. These are all-comer survival rates, so include people who come out of this with significant brain damage as well as those who don't. Some factors that predict how well you're going to do: age, drowning patients do better, partly because people drown in water that's generally colder than air. You can't see non-cardiac causes do worse. In other words, people with other illnesses do worse. But keep in mind that some patients in the 30 to 70 age range have at least a 20% survival rate, which is not huge, but that's 20% higher than it was 30 years ago. With a shock in a box, so these automatic external defibrillators that are popping up everywhere increase your chances even further. So about 9% overall with CPR, about a quarter with an external defibrillator. And if that defibrillator finds a rhythm like ventricular fibrillation that I showed you earlier that's shockable, your chances are a third or greater. So now you're starting to get into numbers that really do confer a large, meaningful survival. So as we wrap up, let me paint you a couple of pictures of what this means. So I've talked a little bit about history, a little bit about the science, talked about what some of the survival numbers are to give you a background. So what does this mean for us ethically? One is there's this growing sense, I think, that there's an obligation to do CPR. And these are some quotes from people who are self-described ethicists about the Lorraine Bayless case, which said, essentially, if we can do CPR, unless there's a clear indication that we shouldn't, we should all be ready to step in and do CPR and resuscitate somebody. That's extended, by the way, to the legal world. There's a legal case that's wending its way through the courts in California. A woman had a cardiac arrest in a Target store and died of what was probably a treatable arrhythmia. A tragedy, certainly. She was in her 40s, but the family sued Target because Target didn't have an automatic external defibrillator in the store. And they argued that Target was negligent in not providing that technology. You could argue about whether that's right or wrong, but there is this growing sense that there should be these options available to everyone. Another problem, something I thought of, is the Munchkin coroner problem. We know that the Wicked Witch, is the Wicked Witch to the east or the west? Who's the first one to die? West and east, right. The Wicked Witch of the West was dead because the Munchkin coroner pronounced her dead. But remember the story I told you about Michelle Funk? The rescuers who showed up after an hour decided to do CPR to try to revive her. An hour later, they could have stopped, but they didn't. So when do you stop? I mean, when I trained, the protocol was really pretty simple. You'd give a couple of shocks, you'd give epinephrine, a couple more shocks, you'd give lidocaine, maybe one or two other drugs, but 10 minutes into a code and you were pretty much done. But now codes go on 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. When do you stop? Especially when you have examples of people like Michelle Funk who came back after 3 hours. Do we go 3 hours for every person? Well, no, but when? We also know that if you go with a cardiac arrest or taken with a cardiac arrest to an emergency department that runs codes longer, you have a better chance of survival. Not hugely better, but better. So when do we stop? I don't know. Something else I think of is the Tiffanys problem. Tiffanys, as many of you might remember from college mythology, was a mortal who was dating Eos, the goddess of the dawn. They got together and asked Zeus for immortality. And Zeus said, yeah, sure, immortality, no problem. They forgot, though, to ask for eternal youth. So Homer tells us that Tiffanys continued to age, continued to get weaker and more frail, but couldn't die. So the story goes, Eos locked him in a room, which seems kind of harsh if you ask me, but whatever. Something like that, I think, is happening in medicine. As I look particularly at our health system at the University of Pennsylvania, where patients come for the most aggressive, most advanced treatment, we can usually restart a heart, but we can't be nearly as effective at treating the heart failure or dementia or advanced cancer or lung disease that led to that cardiac arrest in the future. So we can confer something like immortality, at least from the perspective of a heart, but we can't confer eternal youth. And so we wind up taking care of patients who get older and more frail. We keep restarting a heart, but we can't reverse some of those processes that are making patients sicker and often detracting from their quality of life. And the last implication to get you thinking about is something that I think of as the moral hazard problem of CPR. Moral hazard, many of you know, is what happens when you give people a safety net for a behavior going wrong, and that behavior, that safety net, changes behavior. So the sort of tongue-in-cheek example here is, imagine if you got speeding ticket insurance, so whenever you got a speeding ticket, somebody else would pay for it. You would probably exceed speed limits more often. Something like that is happening, I think, with CPR as well. We're getting so good at bringing people back from the dead, particularly in hospital settings, that it's leading many of my physician colleagues, at least, to be more aggressive in treatment. I know a lot of oncologists would say, well, she's really weak, she's really frail, I'm not sure she can tolerate another round of chemotherapy, but if she doesn't do well and she gets an infection and she gets septic, we can always put her in the ICU and those guys will bring her back. So people being much more aggressive, knowing that if worse came to worst, we could probably bring people back, leading to much more aggressive treatment of people who my oncologist colleagues admit, for instance, that they never would have treated aggressively with chemotherapy 10 years ago, but now technology has evolved to the point that really aggressive ablative bone marrow chemotherapy in an 80-year-old, they never would have done 10 years ago, but they're willing to do now because if worse came to worse, they'd probably be able to bring her back. So, wrapping up, CPR is really pretty easy, honestly. Everybody could do it. Many people in this room probably have done it. Bringing people back from the dead is also relatively easy. Talking about whether, when, and how to do it is challenging, I think. That's why the legacy that Rosemary has left us at the center and the center's work is so important. Teaching physicians, healthcare providers, also patients, family, all of us, how to have these conversations really is enormously challenging. And that's something we need to get much better at. The space in between those two stories comprises a lot of potential events, outcomes, pathways, but the dividing line between them is not that wide. I mean, it doesn't take much for us to go one way or the other, but having the opportunity to have these discussions so we have some say in it is what we really need to think about. So thanks, obviously, to the Center for Practical Bioethics, to Sister Rosemary for bringing us all together. Thanks along the way to the editorial team at Penguin Random House, who's now working on a fourth book for me, and then to the entire animal crowd that I've had a chance to work with. So let me stop there, and
we do have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'd like you to use the microphone. And I'll work this side of the room first, and then we'll move over and give equal time to that side of the room. Questions for Dr. Casarett over here? Anyone? Right here.
Thank you for that talk. Can you hear me? Because I can't hear myself.
I can hear you, but I don't think anybody else can.
I understand that physicians frequently would not recommend for themselves as aggressive a treatment as they recommend for their patients. And I wonder if you could comment on, is that true, and if so, why is it true?
Yeah, it seems to be true, and some of you know this literature better than I do. A lot of those, can people hear the question? Okay, the question was, physicians seem to recommend CPR, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but seem to recommend CPR and aggressive treatment that's less, for themselves, that's less aggressive than what they habitually give to their patients, meaning what physicians want for themselves tends to be less aggressive than what they often provide for their patients. So is that true? The short answer is a lot of those results come from a longitudinal study that was done at Johns Hopkins, which continues to appear in the media every once in a while, although it was published years ago, in which physicians were asked what they would want for themselves. And I'm summarizing a bit, but most physicians said, you got to be kidding. I mean, I would never want anybody doing half of the things that my patients get. And there have been other studies that are along those same lines. Why is that? Well, one, this isn't really a theory, it's sort of a general observation that many of us who are, not just physicians, but nurses and others, anybody who works in a healthcare setting, sees two things. One, how aggressive this treatment can be. I mean, if anybody has done CPR, you've probably had the experience of hearing or feeling ribs crack. I'm sorry to be graphic, but that's the way CPR works. And all it takes is, I still remember the last time that happened to me when I was doing CPR, and it's not a memory that ever leaves you. So they're really vivid images like that of what resuscitation looks like. There's also, I think, for many of us, the memory of what happens when patients don't do well. And sometimes if they don't do well, that means CPR is not effective and patients die. Unfortunately, though, what not doing well sometimes means is CPR is effective, patients wind up in the ICU for long periods of time, and that's the memory that we have. So I think many of us as healthcare providers know all of the ways in which things can go wrong. Members of the general public see television shows where somebody has a cardiac arrest, has an 80% chance of coming back alive, and when they come back alive, they do really well. So I think we're playing with different decks in a way, and we're looking at different information. Who's right? I think the challenge would be to come up with some middle ground, so some of the knowledge that healthcare providers have can be shared with patients in a way that's meaningful and useful without being coercive. If that makes any sense. But thanks.
I have two questions, and they're not really related. One is, I was fascinated by your history of resuscitation, but I wonder when, in fact, of the CPR, the type that we've been taught and that the mechanical pumping part, when that was first done. And then my other question was for the non-medical folks in here. What are your markers for a reduced metabolism when you talk about an animal's metabolism going down to 2%?
Yeah. So let me answer the second question first, because it's either a 2-hour lecture or a really simple answer. The really simple answer is that you actually measure oxygen consumption. And those of you who are biologists, biochemists in the room are probably rolling your eyes, but look, I'm a physician. I've forgotten everything I learned in medical school from biochemistry. So that's the simple version. You actually put a mouse in a sealed container and you measure the uptake of oxygen. More complicated than that, but using oxygen as a measure of metabolism. The first question had to do with recent CPR and when that was created. And I didn't talk about that at all, spent a bunch of time talking about it in the book. There are a couple of elements, and I'll oversimplify because this is kind of a large topic and I'm not a historian. But it's interesting that there are a couple of things that came together really like in the 40s and the 50s. There are a couple of elements. One, the ability to shock somebody's heart back to life, which several people take credit for. I mentioned shocking of chickens from Denmark. Obviously a precursor, not really that clinically relevant. But there's a certain named Claude Beck, who's at least one of the forerunners in that, who back in the 50s was a cardiac surgeon, began using a defibrillator to restart hearts in the operating room. Maybe not the first, but one of the most visible examples. Two people who are often credited with the beginning of CPR, not the only ones, are Peter Safar and James Elam, who were two physicians who began to figure out how to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and specifically how to do it in a way that could be taught. So actually a lot of their interesting experiments were done on, kind of gruesome actually when you think about it, but done on subjects waking up in the operating room who hopefully had given informed consent in advance, although history is a little bit unclear about that. And they would bring in volunteers and they would demonstrate mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on this partially awake patient in front of the volunteer, and then the volunteer would step in and do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on that patient. And then presumably everybody would clear the room and that patient would wake up very confused with odd memories of, I think they did something. Oh, you're just making things up, Grandma. They would never do anything like that. So a lot of their research was not just on how to do mouth-to-mouth, but how to train people to do it. And the other weird story was a group at Johns Hopkins that was doing studies on defibrillation of dogs. inducing ventricular fibrillation in dogs, shocking the dog's heart back. And they noticed in the middle of one experiment that as they put the paddles on the dog's chest, that there was a little spike, a little blip of increased blood pressure in the arterial monitors. And you can imagine, if you're a dog going through these experiments, that's the point at which your day starts to get really, really weird, because not only are you going through defibrillation experiments, but all of a sudden people are pushing on your chest. But that anecdote is often described as kind of the beginning of CPR research, as they realized you could replicate some of the action of the heart simply by pushing on a chest. There's another school of thought that says that you're not actually causing blood flow, you're just sort of sloshing blood back and forth enough to oxygenate it. But those three elements, depends on who you give credit to and when, but kind of in the 40s and the 50s, the electricity part, the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and the actual chest compressions began to come together in a way that led Safar Elam, a group in Seattle, and others to start figuring out how to do that and how to train people. Thanks.
Question that follows, or rather example, with your promo. I was very intrigued and delighted with the conversation about crowdsourcing, CPR, and use of AEDs. The question being, does the person who collapses in front of us even want to be resuscitated? And I think, for me, that is one of our growing ethical dilemmas and conversation that needs to occur in the future. And pondering that quite a bit, I'm wondering if something in the future, such as a medical alert bracelet that says, I don't want CPR. In my advanced directives, that's very clear. And if I'm frail and older and have multiple comorbidities, I can be lucky enough to have an outside hospital DNR. But if I don't fit those categories, and I collapse and somebody resuscitates me, and I didn't really want that, and the underlying pathology that caused me to have to be resuscitated in the first place leads me to a future of ICU, what I would consider to be torture, and repeated events until finally someone will agree to sign an outside hospital DNR. So in thinking about all that you've written, have you come across ideas about that group of persons who don't want to be resuscitated, but they happen to be in the public venue and they get it anyway? And how do we communicate that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a huge challenge. The flip side of crowdsourcing is that, on one hand, if you want to be resuscitated, it's great to be in a room full of conservatively 100 people who all know CPR. That's great. If you don't want to be resuscitated, then being in a room full of 100 people who know CPR is probably the last place you want to be. So yes, you could become a hermit, retire to a cave on a mountainside somewhere, where nobody will find you until archaeologists dig you up 100 years from now. But failing that, it's a bit of a problem. You're right, out-of-hospital DNR orders are one solution, but a solution that only applies to some people under some circumstances. I've often joked that there should be a microchip that could be implanted that would deactivate a defibrillator. So if you had the chip, somebody would apply that defibrillator to you, and it would short circuit, and it wouldn't work, and people would say, oh, well, there goes another one. That doesn't prevent the CPR problem. Again, if you're a room full of 100 eager Boy Scouts who learned how to do CPR and have just been waiting to try it out on somebody, that's not going to end well. So I don't really know. I don't know how to solve that problem. Certainly conversations with family members who can say, who, if they're with you, can say, yes, I know she looks like she's dead. She'd like to stay dead. Thank you. But that raises, right, other ethical issues. If a first responder arrives at the scene and somebody appears to be dead and somebody is standing over her saying, don't touch her, like, well, what do? Do you listen to the person who's alive? Maybe you should, but what if the person who's there, who you don't know, doesn't have her best interests at heart? What do you do then? So even if you did that, that would create problems of its own. So in creating this crowdsourcing technique for CPR, we've definitely improved survival, but we've also created a host of problems that we haven't managed to figure out. It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer for you, but there probably are hermit positions open in Nepal if you wanted to go there.
My question is, how do you define a successful CPR in terms of outcomes? You know, what's the quality of life after a successful CPR? And who decides what the criteria is?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And just in the numbers that I gave you, so success was just defined as it is, unfortunately, in many studies, by surviving to leave the hospital. It's a pretty, I mean, it's a bar, but it's a pretty low bar, right? Seriously, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be walking and talking, able to balance your checkbook, able to go back to the work that you were doing before. It's a pretty low bar. And there's certainly, not being entirely fair, there's certainly cardiology researchers who have tried to parse out better definitions. That becomes very subjective very quickly. And especially if you're thinking about whether, when, how, and for whom you're doing CPR, these are pretty high stakes questions. So you don't want some researcher saying, you know, as long as somebody can walk and feed himself, that's a good quality outcome. Well, yeah, maybe, but not for everyone. So one question is, how do we as a society begin to define a good outcome? Two, methodologically, how do we do that in a way that reflects all of the people? Because your idea of a good outcome is probably not mine. You don't know much about you, you don't know much about me, but because we're two different people, I'm pretty sure we'll have different views of what a good outcome is. And the real question, I think, is how we could tailor these sorts of decisions somehow magically to what your idea of a good outcome is, so that you would get different treatment and different decisions would get made if you have a different idea. So we may have the same survival probabilities, but if your bar for what a good survival is higher than mine, that decisions would get made differently for you if we knew that you wouldn't be happy unless you were able to name all 31 Baskin-Robbins flavors. I would be happy as long as I could sit out on my deck with a martini. So different standards there. I would get resuscitated and you probably wouldn't, but being able to incorporate that in decisions is tough, but that's what we need to do, right? I mean, if we really wanted to take a definition seriously of what a success is, your success is going to be different than mine, and that has to enter into decisions. And we don't really have a way to do that. We do it to some degree with other treatments, like chemotherapy. We can have a discussion about what your quality of life is likely to be with chemotherapy, what sorts of deficits you might have afterwards, and you have the time and the leisure to have those sorts of discussions, or with other procedures like a ventricular assist device, say, or even an implantable defibrillator. But decisions that need to be made within the space of seconds, figuring out how to do that in a way that's humane and compassionate, logical, rational, and well-informed, and really, really fast, that's tough. It's a great question.
One last question. Thank you.
This is going to be building on some of the previous questions. 12 years ago, I had a sudden cardiac arrest, and I was driving a car with my family. So I'm very thankful for CPR. I'm really thankful for external defibrillators. Fire truck happened to pull up, and I was a vice president of a hospital. We had just dedicated a brand new ER, and they saved my life. And the article about cooling people had just come out, and they iced me down. So I had two questions. My wife had two questions, and I still have two questions. And I'd like to insert this into your conversation about advanced directives, because that's one of the things this center has done the best, is getting that conversation going. While my wife waited for me in the ICU for a week, she knew that my heart was beating, but she didn't know how I was going to be mentally. So when I finally came out of that, I was neurologically assessed and all that kind of stuff. I still have an excuse when I forget something. But one of the questions that I've never heard, and I was a chaplain for 25 years in advanced healthcare planning or in case conferences, was this mental status issue. Because you don't talk about that a lot. When the residents are doing CPR for an hour, what's going to happen? And I've seen what's going to happen most of the time. So one question is, how would you even insert that into that conversation? That's not an emergency, but it's a care conference. And the other thing is, now I have a piece of hardware in my chest, an AICD, and at some point, either my agent or I will have to say, turn that off. Because right now I cannot actually experience a natural death. You know, it's going to keep shocking me. So how would you even introduce that kind of thing into a conversation, not in a crisis, but an advanced care plan?
Yeah, so great questions. I think regarding the first question about mental status, it seems like I'm dodging the question. I'm really not. But in general, when I have discussions with patients about future treatment decisions, I try to get a sense of what's important to them. And some people are really driven by function. For some, it's the ability to interact with family. Some it's independence. Some it's mental status and alertness. Or, for most of us, obviously, it's not that simple. It's a combination. But how do people weigh those? And so I always ask where cognitive ability fits in. And to some degree, that's actually easier. So cognitive ability and functional status, those are easier both to assess. Other things that are important to people like independence and dignity are harder to put a number on or harder to describe. So actually, in a lot of the conversations I have, they do revolve around what am I able to do for myself, and am I able to think and speak and remember and recognize family. And the one other thing I'd say about that is that I often ask about specific aspects of mental function. Is it the ability to do the New York Times crossword puzzle? Is it the ability to continue to do your job, to recognize and interact with your grandkids? It seems like different levels, but it's also different attributes. So I know, and so more importantly, the family knows that this is something that she said she always wanted to be able to do, and she told us all she really, really wanted to be able to recognize her family. That was the most important thing to her, and when she's no longer able to do that, that's, back to your question, that's when her quality of life has dropped to a point where she doesn't want for us to continue to keep her going. What was the second question?
AICD.
AICD, right. Sorry, when you stop them. I don't have that excuse, unfortunately, of forgetting things. But jet lag, maybe I'll come up with something else. The facetious answer, which I'll just give you to be provocative a little bit, is that the time to have a conversation about stopping an AICD is when you put it in, or when people put it in to you. And I think that works for AICDs, works for pacemakers, works for feeding tubes, certainly. Like when you're having the discussion about when to start something, that's a great time to talk about what you expect it to do, what you can't expect it to do, why you're putting it in now, and why you might decide to stop it or take it out later. I think that's easier said for feeding tubes than it is for implantable defibrillators. In my experience, I think lots of people keep those AICDs going for a long time. And I think that's okay. I mean, I think there's often a fairly clear measure of quality of life. When it fires, people know that it fires, they remember it, they're also often anxious and scared about it. So that becomes a real quality of life discussion. Like, I don't even know it's there, hasn't fired in 18 months. Well, great. It's firing every week, that's a problem. The one caveat I would give you, not relevant to you, not relevant to anybody in this room, hopefully anytime soon, but when patients enroll in hospice, we're really, really aggressive in our hospice at making sure those defibrillators get turned off. Not against the patient's wishes, so if somebody wants to keep it going, we will, but making sure we absolutely have that discussion, because that's one of those things that should never happen. Somebody who has elected a plan of comfort care, making peace with God and their family, ready to die, but they have this piece of hardware in that's going to keep shocking them. We never, ever want that to happen in my hospice. Again, not necessarily for everyone, but for those people who really have embraced the concept of hospice or palliative care, comfort care, if they're not in hospice, making sure that somebody remembers that piece of hardware is there, and realizing the harm that it can do to people if it's not turned off. So I'm going to stop there, but I'd like to stop by thanking all of you. I mean, you're here because you've supported the center. You're here because this is a topic that's important to you. You're here partly because of Sister Rosemary, obviously, but you're also here because this is an important issue. It's one that you believe in. It's one that you want to think about, talk about. And that's ultimately the way that we both change the culture of dying in the United States. We change the culture of living in the United States. And it's the way that we begin to figure out how to use all of this technology that's coming down the road. So whenever I hear about stories like that of Lorraine Bayless, who didn't get resuscitated and then did but shouldn't have, and then I come to a group like this and I realize there are a lot of people out there who may not have the answers. I mean, if you do, let me know. May not have the answers, but are really ready and willing to think about it and care deeply about this, then I feel much more optimistic that we'll be able to figure this all out as a community. So thanks for all that.